In this video, I want to have a philosophical talk about the current state of our society, because if you look at how things are going, it is clear that something is not working. Streets of cities are now lined with homeless camps. Affording food is becoming more difficult, and the gap between the rich and the poor is becoming more and more extreme. We're in a cost of living crisis. And why is this? What triggered this crisis? Well, I think the easy thing to say is the government. It is their fault. And although there is some truth to that, I think the problem of this crisis is much deeper than the government. I think as our society becomes more and more advanced and complex, with better infrastructure, more economic opportunities, and more advanced technology, we have lost important societal components. In the process of developing as a society, we have lost important societal components that were the glue keeping life affordable. And in this video, I want to challenge you to think critically and talk about 7 societal components that we have lost that has triggered this cost of living crisis. And the first thing is the locally run community. Now, it wasn't too long ago when a community was run and owned by individuals, where you'd have the general store owned by Steve, the hardware store owned by Chuck, and the restaurant owned by Cindy. And the beauty of this local system is that the goal of each of these owners is just to make an honest living and support the community. But now this locally run community is non-existent, and the man got his foot in the door and put everyone out of business. Where the general store was replaced by the Walmart, the hardware store was replaced by the Home Depot, and the restaurant was replaced by the McDonald's. And the problem with these corporations is that their goal is very different from an individual. Their goal is to maximize profits and please their shareholders. And a huge thing that has driven up the cost of living is these locally run communities being replaced by these corporate run communities. Because when we live in communities run by corporations, we care less of our neighbors, structures are more complex, and we put profit over people. And the more you feed these corporations, the hungrier they get. Now, the second thing is the strong family structure. Now, as I said not too long ago, before we sold our soul to the man, we lived in these locally run communities. And you know who else lived there? Our families. You and your kids lived here, your parents lived here, and your family members were all nearby. The family structure was very strong, and there are many economic benefits to a strong family structure, like childcare support, elderly support, resource sharing, and emotional support. However, as life started to become more complex, we started to spread out, and we don't see our families as much, which has made the family structure much weaker, which has come with many economic drawbacks. Childcare support was replaced by daycare. Elderly support was replaced by nursing homes. No more resource sharing and limited emotional support, all of which increased the cost of living. And so another thing that has driven up this cost of living is moving from these strong family units to these weak family units and losing all the benefits that come with it. When we can no longer rely on our families and have to figure out everything on our own, the cost of living increases exponentially. Now, the third thing is the usage of our own 2 feet. Now, another thing that has really changed in the last 100 years is that we've moved from these very compact communities where we can get around by walking and public transportation to these spread out area communities that are 100% car dependent. I mean, in the United States, there are only a handful of places where you can depend on the public transportation in your own 2 feet, but the majority of the United States, you have to own a car. Or you'll just be extremely limited by using very terrible public transportation. And car ownership increases our cost of living a lot more than we think, because we have to pay for car payments, insurance, gas, oil changes, and regular maintenance, which comes out to thousands of dollars a year. Owning a car is expensive, and another thing that's driving up the cost of living is our dependency on cars, where we can no longer rely on getting around by our own 2 feet. Now, the fourth thing is free time. So a huge theme of this video is that what has driven up the cost of living is that we've transitioned to living very simple lives, to living much more complex lives. And as life is becoming more and more complex, we're having less and less free time. I mean, everyone is so busy, working all hours of the weekdays and coming home exhausted. Which has really changed our way of life, because when we live these extremely busy lives, we don't do things like make dinner at home, do physical activity, and relax and decompress. We don't have the time to do these things anymore. And because we don't have the time to do them, a side effect is that we spend a lot more money. Because our lack of time makes us seek convenience, harms our physical and mental health, and makes us impulse buy. And a huge thing that has driven up the cost of living is just not having any time anymore. We don't have any free time. And when we don't have free time, we end up making very snap decisions and outsourcing very simple things in our lives. It's important to take the time to relax and decompress, because when you do things on your own, you end up living much happier lives because your mind isn't scattered. And in the process, you save money. Now, the fifth thing is a small world of comparison. Since the beginning of time, we have always compared ourselves to others and tried to keep up with other people's lifestyles. But a huge thing that has changed recently is who we compare ourselves to, because only 50 years ago, the world was very small and we would compare ourselves with our neighbor with a slightly bigger house, the latest yard equipment, and the latest home appliances and think, I'm not doing as well, and buy these things to keep up. However, nowadays in the information age, who we compare ourselves to has really started to widen, where we can just open up Instagram on our phones and see rich people online with sports cars, giant houses, and luxury clothes and think, I am so poor, and start taking on debt to try to keep up, making us broke. And so another thing that is driving up the cost of living is that who we compare ourselves in our lives to has changed very drastically. Instead of spending a few extra dollars to keep up with the Joneses, we now feel like we need to go in severe debt in order to keep up with the Kardashians. For the first time in history, we can see into the lives of other people, and we end up feeling very bad about how we're living and start making very bad financial decisions. Now, the sixth thing that we have lost that has triggered this cost of living crisis is quality. So if you watch my channel, you know that I recently moved from Colorado to Georgia. And now that I'm living in Georgia and I don't have to worry about some of you creeps trying to find me, let me show you the cool house that I was living in Colorado. I was living in this Victorian mansion that was built in 1889. And if you're not from the United States, here that is old, possibly older than the Great Pyramids of Egypt. Our idea of what is old is actually probably very young if you're watching this from another country. But on the other hand, our country is massive and we could drive for days and still be in the same country. That's why Americans only speak English. You could drive for days and you're still in the same country, not like Europe where you can just drive a couple of hours and you've been to like 16 countries already. But anyways, living in a house that old was such a cool thing because you realize how quality everything was made back then. Everything was made to last. I mean, the structure of the house was solid. The bathtub was hundreds of pounds and the interior was handcrafted. Back in the day, everything was built to last in high quality, but nowadays, nothing is made to last and things need to be replaced often. I mean, discounted furniture only lasts a few years. Fast fashion makes us replace clothes seasonally, and products are simply not made to last. Most things nowadays are very poor quality. Another thing that's driving up the cost of living is constantly needing to replace low quality things. For example, we used to buy a solid dresser that would last a lifetime, but now we need to buy a new one every 3 years from IKEA. And this low quality stuff is causing us to spend more money because we constantly need to replace things. Now, the final thing that we've lost that has triggered this cost of living crisis is simplicity. The cost of living is getting out of control, and it's very easy to oversimplify it and say that it is this person's fault. It's Man Bear Pig that did it. I'm cereal, it's Man Bear Pig's fault. Why doesn't anybody believe me? But I think it is much deeper than just Man Bear Pig. I think if you look about how much our lives have changed, it's very obvious why things are increasing because we used to live very simple lives where we were close to our families, lived in supportive communities, didn't need much, life was slow, and we focused on our space in the world. Life was much more simple back then and we didn't need that much to live. But nowadays, life is a lot more complex, where we have to figure out everything on our own. Communities are non-existent. We have an abundance of options. We don't have time and we're exposed to too much. There are many different factors that are increasing the cost of living, but one factor I think is just we're living in a much more complex world and we have more problems that didn't exist 50 years ago. I mean, whatever happened to predictability? The milkman, the paperboy, evening TV. How did we get to living here? Somebody tell me please. This whole world's confusing me. But we've lost important societal components that were the glue keeping life affordable. And I don't think that there's any going back. But I do think it's important to just see the cons of this complex life that we're living and how it's increasing our cost of living, and try to make attempts in your own life to live a more simple life, and maybe the cost of living won't get as out of control. And with that, muchas gracias, que tengan un buen día. Nos vemos, chicos.